So good morning. Thank you all for joining Building Blocks for Volunteer Engagement, Foundations for Success. This is part two of a 2-week series, though if you weren't here for part one, welcome. They are designed to be taken in succession or independently. If you were here last week, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. A few housekeeping notes as we welcome everyone in. This is being recorded, which means if you weren't with us last week, you are welcome to access that, I believe, through the Volunteer Florida website. So you can watch last week's session. And to those who are watching this as a recording, thank you for participating in this, even if it's not in the live portion. For those who are participating live, thank you to those who are on camera. I love having a virtual kind of front row here. Love the visual feedback. And for those who aren't, we understand and are just glad that you're joining. We also have lots of ways to make this as participatory as possible. We will have time to break for discussion, and I'm a pretty good multitasker, so if you want to post questions or comments in the chat, please use that, and we will be monitoring that. I think, oh, and then the last piece is that we will be posting some handouts on through the chat, and also the handouts, a PDF of these slides, and a link to the recording will be emailed as well. So lots of ways to be able to get the resources. So let me introduce myself again for those who weren't with us last week or whom I haven't had a chance to meet before. My name is Beth Steinhorn. I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. We work with organizations across the US and Canada exclusively on volunteer engagement strategy, helping organizations, municipalities, and others tap into the power of volunteerism. I have been a longtime partner with Volunteer Florida, and I'm very pleased to be bringing this topic, this series to our folks across the state. I'm normally based in Denver, Colorado, but I'm tuning in from the East Coast today, so happy to be on your time zone. Here's a little, well, let me give a little background on why this topic came up. There has been an enormous amount of turnover in the field, in the nonprofit sector, in the public sector, and certainly in volunteer engagement in the last couple years. I may have asked this last week. Certainly, I asked this in conferences I'm at all the time. How many of you have been in your position for 2 years or less, for 4 years or less? And very often it's a lot of hands going up. And even those who have been in the field or in this position for longer than 5 years, experienced professionals, they are often surrounded by folks who are new in their roles, which means we are losing some of the institutional memory and culture around how to engage with volunteers. So these topics, these building blocks for creating strategic roles, how to recruit and cultivate in a changing landscape of volunteerism, how to screen and place volunteers, all of those topics we covered last week, are vitally important. They are the building blocks for success. Today, we're going to be taking this work kind of to that next level, the next build, maybe that next tier, if we're creating a little Lego tower here of building blocks. What's the next tier? Once we have volunteers placed in our organizations, how do we equip everyone for success? How do we train not only the volunteers themselves, but the staff and other volunteer leaders who engage and support with them? How do we hold everyone accountable and support them to success? And then how do we evaluate the work that they're doing and the mission-driven impacts of our organization as a whole, and recognize people for that? So we have a lot to cover in an hour and 25 minutes. So hang on to your hats. We're gonna dive right in. Training. Training is often viewed as, how do we train volunteers? How do we make sure that we give them as much information as they need to begin their position? And how do we support them ongoingly? And yet there's a national initiative, and I'm pleased to partner with Volunteer Florida to help deliver it across the state of Florida, known as Service Enterprise. It's an accreditation that acknowledges excellence in strategic volunteer engagement. And as part of this initiative, we start with a research-driven diagnostic that assesses your organization's engagement practices against leading practices that are accepted and research-driven, as research supported in being associated with truly impactful strategic volunteer engagement. And you get scores on this assessment in 12 different research-based characteristics. And it is often surprising to everyone in the room when I'm debriefing an organization scores, surprising to everyone except myself, when the lowest score comes out as around training, because most organizations think about training. I know we have folks on here. I see, we've got Irene from CERT. There's lots of training for CERT volunteers. Hi, Irene. We have, folks likely from museums who have to train docents to present. We've got volunteers, even if it's just training people how to safely pack and deliver food and package food in a warehouse. We think a lot about training. But usually it's limited to training of volunteers, not of the staff who engage them. And so more often than not, and I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of these assessments, that training score ends up being a little lower because organizations are just thinking about one piece of the pie, training of volunteers. In a truly strategic and effective organization, we think about training of volunteers, training of the paid staff who support and partner with volunteers, and also a culture of engagement overall. Now, we're not going to dive too deeply into culture of engagement, but I can't talk about training without at least acknowledging that training may be a formal workshop, it may be in the moment coaching, it may be resources that are available, but culture, organizational culture, is what people see, what people say, and what people believe. And training fuels culture, and all these people, all these pieces, what people see, what people say, and what people believe, those also are part of training as well. So we'll talk a little bit about culture, but not a ton. But I think it's important to step back and just take a moment and think about, if someone dropped into our organization from another planet, from another world, as a consultant, I drop into organizations and I spend a lot of time listening, looking at documents and seeing, what is it that this organization, what is the culture of engagement here? What is it that people see and say here? Oh, good, we have more. Thank you, Chris. We have other certs on the line here too. So I will, before I dive into the formal training piece, I'd love to just take a moment and invite people to put in the chat, or maybe even briefly unmute if you want and can keep it brief. If I dropped into your organization, what clues would I get about what people in the organization believe about volunteers? Would it be, I believe volunteers are vital to our success? I believe we can't trust volunteers to really do the work. We can't give them high-level work. Or we were founded by volunteers, but now we've had to professionalize, and so volunteers are very limited. There's a lot of different things, positive, negative, completely neutral. What are some of the things that people believe about volunteers at your organization? Volunteers are becoming useful. Okay, interesting. Rosemary says, staff greatly appreciates our staff and is always thanking them. I hope that means they're thanking volunteers as well. And maybe that's what you had intended. Any other beliefs? We couldn't serve the community without them. They're integral to our work. Oh my gosh. Volunteers are required to comply with grants. So sometimes we work in sometimes in hospice or in community legal services. Volunteers are part of, it's regulated that we engage them. So I love to see that there are so many here. Brooke says volunteers are necessary for our organization. I love to see that many of you are saying volunteers are not just nice to have, they're necessary. I love that. And I'd encourage you to also think as we go through the rest of today's session, what does this inspire you to uncover about what you think people say, see, and believe about volunteers in terms of practices and underlying beliefs as we walk through this, because it's what we do, it's the practices that we put in place that begin to shift that culture towards an even more strategic approach. Those of you who are already have a foundation of warm and welcoming and all of those pieces, I love seeing that. That's great to build on. And I suspect with a couple dozen people on this call already, that some of you may not have quite as rosy a picture if we were to dive underneath what some other people may be saying in your organization, or not saying, but believing. So let's go into training of volunteers. I got to keep moving here. Citizen science. Thank you, Rosemary. I love that. Okay, so what we want is a foundation of prepared, knowledgeable, equipped for success volunteers. And in order to do that, in order to achieve that, I see two different buckets of training. There's orientation and onboarding. How does someone go from a not yet volunteer or a newly placed volunteer into being ready to serve? What's that orientation and onboarding? And then there's and that's orientation and onboarding often is consistent for all volunteers regardless of role versus role specific training. So how do these differ? When we look at general orientation and onboarding, this is information about the organizational mission, general volunteer processes or policies. This might be, hey, you need to sign a photo waiver, photo release. We require to have closed-toed shoes in our food pantry or in our zoo or whatever it is, versus role-specific positions. What are the skills a particular volunteer needs to have in order to be successful? What are the safety protocols for each particular role? What are the procedures? How do you check in as a pantry volunteer versus if you're deployed to a school as a tutor? How do you check in? How do you, what are these protocols? How do you track your hours or report impacts, etc.? The goal is that foundation, and there's a lot of different paths to get there. I'll give you a little hint. This division is also true for paid staff, but we'll get to them in a moment. So what comprises an orientation that I believe all volunteers should get? It includes organizational information, context for the work, meeting the team overall. Who's the leadership of the organization? What are the expectations? Is there a volunteer handbook? How do they access it? Is there information about scheduling and processes? Where do they go if they have a complaint? These are important policies that should also be in your volunteer handbook. And I believe that every volunteer, whether they are a board member with a 2-year term, a volunteer who takes a Tuesday shift, or someone who's just coming on a Saturday to do a yard cleanup as part of a neighbor to neighbor program, everyone deserves an orientation that includes this information. For a board member, it may be part of a half day or full day or 3-day retreat or a series of meetings, but they deserve this information as well. And for a docent in a museum or a naturalist in a gardens or state park, it may be a series of a couple sessions, or maybe part of a series of a couple sessions. But even if it's just a 1-day, we're coming to help hand out water at a fundraising walk, at least 10 minutes of their day of orientation or in a pre-event video should cover what's the mission of the organization. How does this event fit into all of this? That is the important piece of an orientation. No volunteer, in my view, should leave even a resale shop after having folded clothes for 4 hours without understanding how this work fits into the larger picture. That is distinct from a role-specific training program. Role-specific, we need to think about what do they need to know in order to do this particular position, whether it's treasurer of the board or 2 hours of folding clothes in a resale shop. We need to understand what they need to know in order to start and effectively fulfill this position. So what are your goals for training? What content do they need to understand and gather? What's the best way to deliver it? And how are we going to assess and evaluate whether they have gleaned enough information, mastered the skills they need to in order to start? Most organizations are pretty good at the first three, and very few, in my experience, or a much lower percentage, think about that assessment and evaluation other than, did they sit through the training? Great, let's let them do XYZ. But in many cases, it's important to think about that assessment. So when we think about the content, what are our goals? What do we want to deliver? I always think back to a question that my mentor taught me, the original founder of this company, the great Jill Friedman Fixler. She always asked this question: what gaps in knowledge or skill would impede a volunteer in this role? What gaps in knowledge or skill would impede a volunteer in this role? That's a very different question than what do they need to know? What do they need to know? Instead, we're looking at it kind of through a different window. What would impede their success if they don't know this? So I started my career, some of you know this, I started my career working in museums. And I remember conversations between educators, curators, and exhibit designers when we were opening a major new exhibition. This was many decades ago. And the curators, the paleontologists, wanted the interpreters, volunteer interpreters, to know every species of prehistoric rhinoceros. And the educator was saying, actually, they just need to know one, because the purpose of their existence in this gallery is to engage visitors in exploration and discovery, not to lecture on every species of prehistoric rhinoceros. The other, and when you look at it as what gaps in knowledge would impede this role, you know what else they need to know other than just one species of prehistoric rhinoceros? They need to know where the restrooms are. They need, right? They need to know what are the answers to the most frequently asked questions by visitors. And the most frequently asked questions by visitors do not include what are the other 37 species of prehistoric rhinoceroses, right? I don't remember the number because I didn't have to teach that to them. So I think it's a great question. What are the gaps in knowledge? And then the next question, when you have your set of content, is what's our delivery method? It's so, I mean, one of the, I don't want to call it a silver lining of the COVID pandemic because that was obviously horrific, but one of the things that the pandemic shook us up and helped us get beyond was relying too heavily on in-person workshops. There are myriad other ways that we can deliver content. We can have on-demand recordings. There can be an online or in-person resource center. Formal mentoring. It doesn't always have to be pre-service training. You could train volunteers and then get them just about ready to start and allow them kind of a very shallow, is that the word I'm looking for? Like an easy on-ramp, not a very steep on-ramp to starting service by having some mentoring, basically doing an apprenticeship, which is on-the-job experience. You could offer continuing education. Many volunteers are motivated by the chance to learn and are eager to continue learning once they're beginning their service. There may be job aids and tools, little checklists and things that they can access. And even for episodic volunteers, short-term volunteers, what is it that they need to know, and can we just provide it in 20 minutes at the start of a big event, or half an hour of safety training before a Habitat for Humanity build, for example. So there's many, many, many delivery methods. And when we talk about training, we want to make sure that it's not just in-person or Zoom workshops. There's lots of ways to ensure people have access to resources they need. And then the question is, how are we going to assess whether they are ready? Irene says they need to know where to find the resources to answer the questions. Yes, exactly. One of the things they need to know maybe is that they don't need to know the answer to every question if they're an interpretive volunteer or a public education volunteer, but they need to know where to get the question. And that's actually kind of a culture piece as well. Are we training volunteers to know that it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that, but here's where we can find out together, right? That's a great piece. So how do we assess when they are ready to begin service? There's two types of, I think it's important to distinguish between assessment and evaluation of training. Assessment of a volunteer's readiness versus evaluation of whether our training was in fact effective. So how are we going to assess whether a new trainee or even a veteran trainee who's asked to retake training, because maybe we've changed, the information is updated, how can we assess whether they have the knowledge and skills in order to be ready to serve? We could certainly give a formal test. It's not very common, but it can happen. And sometimes if a volunteer is required to be certified in CPR or something else, or have a valid driver's license, obviously there are tests involved, even if we're not the ones administering it. It could be a practical test, like we'd like to observe you provide this tour, or show us, let's watch you for a little while packaging or solving this, not coming up with a great example. We're going to observe you as you pull the right weeds if we're doing weed mitigation and, invasive species mitigation in a public lands. We could do a situational test where we might give some scenarios, or simply we can observe them. So, so I think it's really helpful to think about, what is it? Is it just seeing that they participated or watched a video, or is there something else that they can, that you can do to assess them? And I think I talked about this last week quite extensively, if successful completion of training is a a requirement in order for service, then you need to say that. You need to be, it would be important to disclose that from day one, not in a threatening way, just to know, and we're going to support you to success. And we want to make sure that you've gotten this information, and if you haven't, we'll continue to work with you, or we'll provide you with a mentor, or we may need to find a different role for you. But it's important to disclose that early on, so that if someone is not demonstrating that they have mastered the information you need them to master, or at least made progress on it, it won't be a surprise if they are not fully placed and scheduled. All of this is different from evaluating your training effectiveness. They're related, but it is a little different. You could provide a survey and ask, how well did this training prepare you to serve? I wouldn't do that question right after the training. I would do it once they've been serving for a couple weeks, so they understand, oh, I didn't learn anything about this and I'm facing this every day, right? Maybe you could interview them, you could get some informal feedback, or you could find out program data, like maybe you're having evaluations from your program participants. How is that reflective of whether the volunteers were well equipped to provide this tour or answer their questions, or get them onboarded as a client if they're a client intake volunteer, whatever that is. So there's lots of different sources to find out where you might need to tweak your training, and volunteers can give input into that, but that's different from saying, are we assessing whether this one particular individual is ready to serve? So that's a little bit, very quickly, about training volunteers. I want to talk about the area that most organizations are less likely to be investing time and thought in, and that is staff training. Training staff to engage volunteers effectively is an important, I believe, an important aspect of any volunteer engagement professional's role. So I'd love to see if any of you put in the chat, if any of you are also responsible for training your colleagues to effectively engage and support volunteers. Often we do this through the typical webinar, through PowerPoints, and I have permission to share from one of your colleagues, Sarah Sukram from Pasco County Animal Services in Florida. Her philosophy and some of the great things that I think they embody at Pasco County around training of staff. Obviously, there's, here's some samples from a training, a PowerPoint that she does, working with our fellow team members. She has some quick facts. She has a really lovely org chart where it's not just your typical hierarchy. It's really focused on these are our different service areas, and here are all the different ways volunteers support each of these major service areas. And she gets right in there and kind of faces head on issues like, how do you handle tough? Volunteers are our colleagues, and you are empowered to teach, coach, and correct. So often I come across clients or workshop participants or just others in the community who are worried that they can't provide feedback to volunteers because they're giving their time freely. Well, volunteers by and large want to be successful and are open to feedback, especially when it is done in a way that is constructive. So Sarah trains her colleagues specifically around this. Here are steps you can take. Here are some great ways to provide feedback positively, relate the why behind the what, give your context for why we ask you to do something in a certain way, and what isn't appropriate. Don't use opinions instead of protocol. Don't speak to people. Don't promote this hearsay. Go straight to the people and involve the appropriate team members. Don't use demeaning language or tones. Don't make it personal. It's just really great, very logical, very unemotional types of advice that are very, very helpful. But what I love about what they do at Pasco County is it's not just the 2-hour orientation or training. She incorporates training tips into everyday communications. So here's an email that goes out on a monthly basis that goes out to staff that talks about last month's results on onboarding experience. And yet in this email, she incorporates a few little tips. Here are a few things to consider as we head into April, which happens to be National Volunteer Appreciation Month, right? What does a first impression look like? Are we meeting the volunteer in the lobby? What terminology are we using? All of our acronyms are challenging and not everyone understands them. So think about what we're saying and how it's being received. Who's going to be welcoming volunteers? Who's in charge of this? And when it isn't their day to work, who's going to be assigned this role in their absence? So these are all really, really helpful ways to integrate training into everyday communications. I think it's really, really vital. As a result of this, as a result of her efforts, I believe, she's very humble, she would say it wasn't her, but I believe it is, they have fueled a culture change. In fact, the director of animal services said when I was doing a site visit for them, our volunteers went from a workload to a workforce. And what a beautiful statement about the culture shift that they, through their work, partly through Service Enterprise, but also just through their leadership, have effectively curated across the organization, that for staff across Pasco County Animal Services, volunteers went from being a burden, something I had to do and think about and make time and find ways to keep volunteers busy, to instead partners in the work and truly being a workforce. To me, that is how, when you effectively train volunteers and staff, you also begin to shift the culture piece, which is why I have that in that kind of tripartite pie. So when you're training staff, what are some ways to do it? I'll quickly walk through a couple steps, and you'll have some tools and handouts and in the PDF of these slides as well. How can you begin to enhance or even create a training program for staff? First, you want to assess, identify your needs, audit your current trainings. Where are we already training staff? Is it in all hands meetings? What do they get in terms of new employee orientation? Where are there opportunities other than just saying, okay, y'all come, we're going to have a 2-hour workshop and please send your staffs. It's not bad to do that, but assess what training is already happening and what are the opportunities. And once you do that, also begin to assess what are the needs. And you're going to be able to gather that by hearing, by really tuning in and listening to what are you hearing from staff, from management, and from volunteers that indicate some possible gaps in knowledge and pain points that staff may be experiencing. How can you tune into those things and say, I often get questions about this, or I'm seeing that staff are just not using our volunteer management software system. I think I need to provide a training. Or maybe you have a new tool or protocol that needs to be rolled out. All of those are great opportunities to create a training. So once you have the content, I recommend really thinking about what's the big idea that you want to communicate. If there's one thing and one thing only that they leave this training or glean from this resource, what is it? What's the right format for it? How do you develop it? And how can you set expectations? So we're going to take each of these for one at a time. What's the big idea? When you're doing any sort of training for staff or for volunteers, it's helpful to identify that priority takeaway. What's the new understanding? Or instead of a new understanding, do you want them to change behavior? Do you want them to comply with a protocol? Or is there something else that you want them to do and understand if they only took one thing away? And as examples, it might be something like, you just are really hopeful that staff members will leave saying, I can engage a skilled volunteer. I don't need to engage them and keep them busy for a whole year. But if I have an 8-week project, I can work with my colleague in volunteer management and volunteer engagement and engage a skilled volunteer who's going to help me with this one thing. Maybe the training is, they're going to leave and say, oh, I can actually help with recruitment. Posting a volunteer opportunity is really easy. Maybe behavioral interviewing is not as mystifying as I thought. And if I utilize it, I may be able to find a really good candidate for this volunteer position. Or maybe it's, using the volunteer management software is really going to make my job easier. And if I just invest a little time in that, it's going to be worth my while. So what's that big idea? And then select the format. You could incorporate, if you work with leadership, maybe you are leadership, anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how long and robust your new employee training is, you can incorporate a section of the new employee in training on volunteer engagement so that new employees know from day one that volunteers are a vital part of this organization. Even if they are an accountant for your organization and they don't interact with volunteers, although I have a couple clients where they have a huge team of volunteer accountants, but that's a different story. But even if they are in a role that doesn't typically engage volunteers directly, they're likely going to be encountering them. So every employee should understand how volunteers fit into the agency. Maybe it's on onboarding for new volunteer or new staff members. Maybe it is a formal workshop or brown bag or a mini training, which I'm going to talk about and define in a moment. It could be in the moment coaching. Did you just observe a staff member miss an opportunity to provide feedback or give misinformation to a volunteer? How can you in the moment provide some coaching to them so it doesn't turn into a bigger deal than it needs to be, but what can you have prepared kind of in your back pocket? Ongoing communications like we saw from Sarah and Pasco County? How can you incorporate little training tidbits into your staff newsletters, into monthly emails? What about job aids, checklists, things like that? I'll share some examples. Or on-demand videos. You could do short on-demand videos or give them access to any number of free ones that are available through Volunteer Match, through our website, vqstrategies.com, others where you don't have to create everything yourself. There's a lot out there in the world that they can also access. So think about what's the appropriate method to deliver the training. And here are some examples. Here are some job aids. This was adapted from a Red Cross tool. It's a sample volunteer check-in checklist. So this is for a staff member to help onboard a volunteer and to check in with them ongoingly. So what do you do in advance? What's your preparation? Let's review the work plan and the position description. Let's prepare questions. Let's note any upcoming team meetings that you want to invite them to. Then while you're meeting, welcome them, do an informal check-in, review the action items from our last meeting, check in on preferred communication methods. Here's a couple questions, and then here's where we want you to document that as a follow-up. It's just basic management, but it's good to have a checklist to demystify that for fellow staff members. You can also have things posted. This is from History Colorado, where I live, our statewide history and archaeology agency with 9 sites all around the state. And this was something that was up in the copy room, and it was just a quick look for staff as people are standing there copying some things. Hey, you want a volunteer to work with you? Here are some steps to do that. Just a nice eye-catching piece. Here are 2 pieces from Star of the Sea Foundation down in the Florida Keys. What's on your volunteer orientation checklist, and how are you going to debrief it? And secondly, they included in a new program checklist, what are some of the things we want to think about when someone is suggesting or proposing a new program? They had a list and realized it didn't include volunteers. And so they added questions like, how can we incorporate volunteers into this program? Are any existing volunteers a good fit for the positions we would need? You can see you can get as fancy as History Colorado did, or you can just have a nice little word checklist like Star of the Sea Foundation did. It doesn't have to be elaborate or a heavy lift. So I want to talk briefly about options that go beyond that 2-hour training for staff, which is often so typical. And the reason I want to do this is because a couple years ago, around 2017, 2018, we had been working with a number of large national organizations to create trainings for their staff, often like 10-part, hour-long each webinars that we would customize, deliver, and it would be recorded and people would be able to go back. Sometimes it was actually, like with Red Cross, it was 3 full days of training for staff on volunteer engagement. And after we did that, around 2018, we started getting calls from not just 1 and not even 2, at least 3 different national organizations, all coming back and saying, we love the training, it was great, but now that we've had it going for a couple of years, could you please repackage it and put it into 20-minute chunks? It's like, what? 20-minute chunks? Yes, we're finding that people really are not tuning into these hour-long sessions. And instead, we want to figure out how we can support our engagement specialists in working with their teams to do something that's much shorter and much more nimble. And so we piloted and began and have since been promoting what we call mini trainings. A mini training is defined as something that is 30 minutes or less. It focuses exclusively on one discrete topic or one tool or practice, and follow-up is expected. The most important piece is that it's often based on the idea that you're not asking people to come to you, you're going to them. So it's integrated into another convening. This is about getting on the agenda of another department's regular meetings, for example, and saying, can I get 20 or 30 minutes on your staff agenda in animal care or in client services or in our school curriculum program or whatever the mission of your organization is, and just introduce this one thing. So what are some typical topics that would fit a mini training? It could be how to write a position description, how to design an effective recruitment ad, how do you leverage behavioral interviewing, how do you provide volunteer feedback? That's the number one topic that I've seen turned into mini trainings. How do you operate this volunteer management software function, right? Just a very specific topic. And at Pasco County, they do that. This is a 9-slide deck where, frankly, if you just pulled out the intro and the closing stuff, it's really about 6 slides of content. So it's very brief, and that's on volunteer onboarding. So I think a key, and one of the tools that was posted earlier in the session is a mini training. Oh, they were just posted. Brittany, if you're able to repost them and share them to everyone, they're just posted for me right now. So if you could post them to everyone and folks can download them, then everyone will be able to see them. I think that'll be easier. So one of the things you'll be getting is a mini training guide that gives you a sense of how to develop and time out a 20 to 30 minute session, and a few tips. Like, there we go. So they're now reposted. Thank you, Brittany. So everyone should be able to download them. And it gives you some tips on what can you do beforehand to make sure that like division director can communicate that you're going to be there. How can you set expectations? Let people know that you are going to be there for a specific reason, and that some follow-up afterwards will be expected. Another piece that I think is really important is for you, as I'd like to say, internal consultants, internal experts on volunteer engagement, to embrace your role as a coach. So how can you do that? If you want to embrace your role as an internal consultant and be a resource, a coach for your colleagues, then I think it's really helpful to prepare in the moment coaching. I like to call this kind of the 5-minute mini. You need to tune into teachable moments and then prepare ahead a few tips, a few speaking points that you believe, based on your experience, you're likely to encounter in the moment. Maybe it's about how to provide volunteers feedback. Maybe it's about, I hope not, but maybe you hear staff members complaining about volunteers, maybe even in front of other volunteers. What are some of the issues that you want to debunk, that you want to minimize, that you want to nip in the bud? Prepare one tip, a few speaking points, and kind of have that in your proverbial back pocket, or actually have it in your back pocket, or put some notes on your phone or something, so that you are ready to pull that out when you see it happening and can address it right away. Not in front of other people. Ask the person in question to step aside and, do you have 5 minutes? I'd love to provide some ideas to help when you encounter this situation next time. And then you follow up with an email and say, here are a couple additional resources and opportunities. When you do that, you really position yourself in a supportive role and as a resource. So we're not going to go into big breakouts because we have so much more material to cover and we're only halfway through the session, but I'd love to just open it up, and we still have enough folks here. We're still under 4 dozen here, that I'd be happy to just take a break for a couple minutes and discuss, are there some topics that you know your colleagues need training on? What would be the big idea? Are there formats you hadn't thought about that you might consider? And are there any steps you might take to make this happen? So I'm not gonna force silence on us, but I'm gonna kind of verbally tap dance for a moment while you consider those, and maybe even jot down some notes. Is there a topic that you think colleagues could really benefit from training on? Are you able to now articulate the big idea or identify a topic? And if you're willing to share, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'm happy to have you unmute and share a thought or two. What resonates with you about training fellow staff? Anyone willing to give a thought? Team building activities, Irene says. Okay, great. Love it. Love it. What else? Between volunteers and staff. Brooke says, I think getting ahead and adding training how to work with volunteers during onboarding would be very valuable. I agree. And there's that is often one of the first things that I see organizations seeking service enterprise accreditation, this national accreditation that recognizes excellence, incorporating. It's incorporating volunteer engagement into staff position descriptions and incorporating volunteer where appropriate and incorporating volunteer engagement into new employee orientation and onboarding. So I love that you're seeing that, Brooke. Karen says, I think it's sometimes hard when there are different opinions on how volunteers should be trained and utilized in an area. So another area of training could be going to different departments and facilitating conversations about how volunteers could be strategically engaged. I think last week I shared some needs assessments and process analyses that could be leveraged to help not just you, but your colleagues identify ways to engage volunteers. And that's something you could facilitate in other department meetings, because you're right, Karen, it is difficult when there are different ideas. So you can embrace your mantle of leadership and say, I'm going to facilitate this conversation. And hopefully that will make some of it less difficult, but having leadership buy-in is obviously very important. Chris says we have leadership mixers. Great. Any other questions about training before we kind of wrap up training and move on to support and accountability? Aha moments or questions? Okay. We did a Hungry for Knowledge. It was virtual and everyone could have their lunch while taking the mini training. I love it. Love it. Hungry for Knowledge. That's great. Well, feel free to keep posting questions, but we have a lot more to cover. So let me just wrap up some pieces about training. Couple things I didn't even have a chance to. Oh, I love that, Karen, having senior volunteers training newer volunteers. Leverage experienced volunteers to help onboard your new ones. Another thing we didn't really talk about, like having mentoring in that way, is combining staff and volunteer trainings where appropriate. If you work in disaster services and you're training staff on compassion fatigue or burnout, invite volunteers to that. Then they're taking these things together. If you're training staff on how to provide feedback to volunteers and you have volunteer leaders, include your volunteer leaders in that training. Deliver thorough orientations and onboarding to all volunteers. I would add and staff. Design and deliver comprehensive role-specific trainings for each position. Present information in multiple ways to effectively reach people who learn differently, who access information differently. Include volunteer engagement in all staff trainings, and position yourself as a leader and consultant to all. When we do that, we are setting ourselves up for success in terms of engaging and supporting volunteers. So the building blocks for supporting volunteers and creating accountability starts with pieces we talked about last week: having strategic roles, having thorough screening and thoughtful placement. So those pieces include well-crafted position descriptions, which we spent some time talking about, but the next step is who's familiar with them? Who's responsible for making sure that the volunteers are familiar with them? If you in volunteer services or whatever area of the organization you sit writes the position descriptions, but you don't share them with the food pantry manager or the tutoring manager or the client services person, then or the retail shop manager, how are they supposed to support the volunteers if they don't know what they're doing? If they don't know what the volunteers are there to do, right? We need to make sure that all staff who are engaging with volunteers understand what role the volunteers are playing, and that we're clear on who is actually sharing that with the volunteer as well. And as we talked, the next piece is, how do you recruit, vet, and place volunteers? What's your role in each? Does everyone involved know how placement decisions are being made? If you are recruiting and screening volunteers for someone who's getting parapastoral care volunteers or program lead volunteers, then are you getting input from those program managers to make sure that you're screening for the right skills? Would it make more sense to have them make the decisions, ultimately placement decisions, because they're going to have a greater investment in the success of someone that they selected? So we have to think about who's involved in those steps. Next building blocks are clear expectations and sufficient training, which is what we spent a fair amount of time just talking about. The number one question I get is, how do we create accountability among staff and volunteers? In fact, I have a coaching call coming up with a faith-based organization in South Carolina after this training, and the leader reached out to me yesterday and said, here's what we really need to talk about. How can we make sure that there's accountability? And what I'm going to be saying is, you can't have accountability without expectations. You can't create a culture of accountability if no one knows what they're being held accountable to. That's why onboarding and training, which we just spent 45 minutes talking about, is so important. That's your setup for having a culture of accountability. Then we move on to checking progress, and that's about feedback and checking in. How do you check in with volunteers? How do you equip your colleagues to check in regularly with volunteers? A great little series of questions to ask yourself is, do these volunteer leaders know what they're supposed to accomplish? Do they have sufficient authority to accomplish it? Do they have the skills to do it? That gets back to training and assessment of skill acquisition. Do we know how we've agreed to measure success? And has anyone let them know if they are succeeding? These are great checklist of questions for you to share with colleagues as well of, wow, are we checking in? And it's not just, how's it going? How's it going is nice, but it doesn't get to, how's it going towards our agreed upon goals? Do you have any questions about that? Is there anything you need from me in order to be successful? Do let me report what I'm seeing from the data, what I'm hearing from our clients. Those are all important pieces of feedback, which is that last building block of setting us up for success. Feedback, simply put, is providing information about how an individual is doing in their efforts toward achieving a goal. But it isn't really simply put, right? I said simply put, but there's a lot packed into that. There are a lot of assumptions built into that. One of those assumptions is everyone is aware of what the goal is. That's why I think a position description is so important. And a position description that doesn't give a laundry list of all the things a volunteer is expected to do, but rather a bulleted list of there are other pieces to it, but instead of a laundry list of duties, it's 3 to 5 key responsibilities. What are the 3 or 4 things that this volunteer is responsible for? And what's the intended impact and outcomes? That's the goal. That's the piece about the goal. And if we don't articulate that and explicitly talk about that at the beginning and agree to it, we have no basis for feedback. So what are some methods for providing feedback? This is, as I've mentioned before, one of the number one things I'm asked about, or pain points that I see in organizations, is that staff and volunteer leaders are uncomfortable or uncertain about how to provide feedback to volunteers. So I want to share just a couple quick methods before we move on to recognition that you can, let's call them frameworks for feedback that you can select from and apply, and even more importantly, that you can use to train your colleagues in how to do this. So one is the model, which many of us incorporate maybe without having known there was a name for it. And that is looking not at feedback, but instead of something known as feed forward. Feedback is important, but it's also helpful to understand that traditional feedback focuses only on the past, and there's a fundamental problem with that type of feedback. By focusing on the past, on what's already occurred, it focuses on things that can't be changed, as opposed to the infinite variety of opportunities that can happen in the future. So traditional feedback can be very limited and static as opposed to expansive and dynamic. Feed forward, a term coined, I believe, by Marshall Goldsmith, he has certainly written a great deal about it, hones in on what people would like to change in the future. It explores ways to translate these ideas into goals and commensurate actions. Feedback, as opposed to feed forward, focuses on performance problems that have occurred in the past, while feed forward really looks at what are the possibilities for improvement in the future. And it relies on questions. Again, I think many of us probably do this naturally, or it has been used with us in giving us feedback, but it's helpful to see it as a model. So it engages the individual in a dynamic conversation in which their answers through their answers or through the discussion, they can develop a plan to improve performance in the future. Questions play a key role in feed forward because they promote this dynamic dialogue and create a space for collaboration. So questions like, how can this conversation be most useful to you? What insights did you gain from what happened as you interacted with that visitor or that client? What are you going to do differently next time? That's really, really key. And one of the ones that I personally find incredibly useful, it was something I benefited from with a director to whom I reported for many years. We would end every meeting, you know, every other week, manager director meeting. Hey, Beth, do you know what we agreed on? You know what your focus is for the next couple of weeks? Yes. And and he would end it with, what do you need from me in order to be successful? How can I help and support you? Like on the last item on this list. And I just think it's really vital because it positioned my supervisor, and in this case, your staff person, it works with a volunteer as well, as a support to success, right? It left me with a few really important sentiments that were crystal clear. One is, I was expected to be successful. What do you need from me in order to be successful? I was expected to be successful. There was accountability here. But second, I wasn't in this alone. He was there to help if I needed it, whether it was more training, different resources, championing my work to senior leadership, whatever it was. And again, I have translated this into my work when I was an ED supervising skilled leadership volunteers. I ended all of our meetings with our skilled volunteers with, what do you need from me in order to be successful? It's a combination of so many others. You're not alone. You're part of this team. I have expectations of you, and I can help you be successful. So that's a taste of feed forward. I want to be really clear, though, that of course there are situations where feed forward and the next model I'm going to share are not appropriate. If someone has egregiously broken protocol or shown up to work under the influence of alcohol or put volunteers or your capital resources at risk, we're not going to have a conversation about how are we going to help you. What do you think about this situation? Like, there are reasons, egregious rules, egregious offenses against the rules and safety that warrant release of a volunteer, but that's usually an exception rather than the rule. In most cases, this type of model, feed forward or the one I'm going to share now, are appropriate. So here's another model developed and coined by Rick Lynch and Steve McCurley in their kind of classic book, Volunteer Management. And they call it the WRAP method: review the past, analyze the present, and plan for the future. I use this a lot, again, when I'm working with volunteers, when I'm working with my associates in my company. And here's how it works. Takes a little preparation. which all good feedback should deserve. Review the past. I want to be really clear that reviewing the past is not restating a laundry list of past offenses. This is not about saying, and then I heard you did this, and remember 3 years ago when blah, blah, blah. That's not what it is. We're not laundry listing. We're not shaking out, airing our dirty laundry here. This is about what expectations were communicated, during onboarding and training. These things are all linked together. What previous interventions may have occurred, like, and last time we had a conversation, we agreed that this was going to happen. So what were those expectations? If there were previous interventions, what were those? Analyze the present. What's the key problem? What was the observed behavior that diverges from that expected behavior? So it might be something like, hey, we understand that, or if you recall during training, we said that our philosophy is to engage visitors in, I'm stuck on my museum mentality here, engage visitors in observational learning. It's not training everything there is to know about ancient Chinese bronzes. Our goal in our education division is to help engage students in active observation of art. Do you remember that from our training? Yes. Okay. What we observed was you weren't noticing that kids had a lot of questions and comments, and instead were lecturing about XYZ. So how can we help you use more of these? And this is why it diverges, and this is where it's a problem. We get feedback saying that's not what the teachers want their students to be engaged in, right? So that's the review the past, analyze the present. The piece where feedback often falls off is at that point. And what they're missing is the very vital third piece, which is planning for the future. How do we agree on expectations moving forward? What will we do to support them in this? Do others need to be involved? Do they need new training? Can we provide resources? What will happen if things don't work out? And maybe it's not even delivery. Maybe it's something about a volunteer who's chronically late. How do we find out what's going on? What do they need? If they can't get there on time, what's the issue? Maybe it's about a bus schedule and we need to recognize that this volunteer just needs a later shift in the day. How are we going to accommodate that moving forward? It's a way to take the emotion out of all this and look at observed behaviors. Lots of stories about this. I'll just share one very briefly. I was doing site visits for an organization in California that rescues, rehabilitates, and in most cases releases marine mammals. And I arrived at one of the satellite locations along the beautiful coastline to do a little site visit there. And the volunteer manager, like pulled me aside into like a storage closet and said, we really need help with a feedback issue. There's a volunteer who has a really annoying voice. How do we provide feedback on that? And I was like, what? Can you say that again? She has such an annoying voice. It drives everybody crazy. And I don't know how to provide feedback on that. And I thought about these slides. I thought about this framework and I said, okay, what does she say with that annoying voice? Oh, she always interrupts. She doesn't listen to what the shift captain says. I'm like, oh, okay. So let's look at expectations and look at where it diverges, where behavior diverges from that. The expectations in a dangerous, life-saving endeavor of trying to feed and tube a seal or a sea lion that's in captivity requires a hierarchy and respect for the captain who is directing a team working with an animal that weighs hundreds and hundreds of pounds, right? Volunteers need to respect that hierarchy and understand when and how to be able to ask questions. So I was able to get beyond she has an annoying voice, because that was like the presenting problem, and instead coach them to recognize that they didn't need to do any feedback on her voice. It really was more about the fact that she was not following protocols, not respecting the authority, and they could go back to the training and explain for the safety of everyone, humans and marine mammals, it was vital that these protocols be saved. So it was that WRAP framework that helped me help them make this not personal and focus on the real issue, which was that they were diverging from protocols that are there for a very good reason. So I hope that these will be helpful models for you. The pieces that I think are important, we didn't talk about retention here, but I think that the two key pieces for this section of support and accountability are, we have to remember that what brings people to engage is the same thing that keeps them volunteering, the chance to make an impact. So if we frame our feedback and all our supports in that lens of this is all about serving our clients, reaching more people, getting more advocacy out there for, for people to be aware of how to manage chronic diseases or increase funding for whatever, whatever it is you're advocating or legislation, whatever it is, we need to keep our impact in mind and make that the goal, and the framework for sharing feedback and hopefully designing training and as we'll talk about in a moment, celebrating their efforts towards that end. And feedback is the fuel for accountability. Staff and volunteer leaders benefit from training on how to provide effective feedback. So in our last 15 minutes, we are going to do a whirlwind tour of talking about evaluation and recognition, which is outcome focused. What brings people to volunteer is often a chance to make a difference. What they want out of their recognition and acknowledgement is understanding how their work made a difference. Volunteers are really important to share feedback with, but also you may be sharing, not feedback, sharing impact with, but you may also be sharing with funders, with community members, staff, the beneficiaries, the people you're serving, as well as leadership. So how do some of you track impact? Not a rhetorical question, a real question. Feel free to unmute or write in the chat. What are some of the ways that you track and measure the difference that volunteers make on behalf of your organization? This is a major building block, kind of wraps the whole volunteer engagement cycle together as a bookend to strategic roles. Anyone typing? Keep track of their hours in a volunteer program. Thank you, Jenny. That was what I expected. I'm glad you wrote that. That is, and others track hours, projects, and share in an impact report. Love that, Rosemary. Great. Keep them coming in. Track number of hours and number of participants for grant compliance. So glad you said that, and I'm glad you used the word compliance. Oh, good, the dollar amount that volunteer hours is equivalent to. Perfect. So here's the good news. You are all doing what most organizations do, what has been the industry standard for quite a while. Looking at volunteer time, maybe translating that into a wage replacement value. And a lot of that is in order to comply with grants. I want to share with you why that is. What are the pros and cons of doing that? I'm not trying to convince you to stop doing that, especially when it is traditional and you are in many cases needing to do it for grants. But I also want to show you the tremendous limitations of that model and offer some alternatives, outcomes, and mission-centered evaluation. And we're going to do this fairly quickly, but I'm just going to give you a taste and hopefully leave you with a lot of food for thought. It has been the standard to track hours. And then if we're going to get really enlightened, we're going to translate that into a dollar value based on wage replacement, often using the amount that is published every year by independent sector. The national value as of April last month was $33.49. For Florida, I guess it was $33. You could also get really enlightened and say, hey, we're going to look up, if we're a Habitat for Humanity, we're going to look up what carpenters make per hour, and we're going to translate those volunteers who do carpentry work to to that dollar value, and we're going to look at those who work in our restore of what a retail worker might work, and we're going to look at our Bureau of Labor Statistics and think about hourly wages based on actual work being done. The problem with this is manyfold. It only communicates quantity, not efficiency or impact. It celebrates more is better. And yet it doesn't even recognize the investment we make as an organization in volunteer engagement. Volunteers may give their time freely, but they are not free to engage. We have to make an investment. So it's only one side of the equation. This is one of the problems. It makes it look like we are getting this work for free, and then it also makes it look like an organization in tough times could cut staff and still get that free labor. And that isn't true. If there are no staff members there to actually, or volunteer leaders, to actually engage in this. So one of the steps that has been developed, or one of the models that's been developed in the last 13 years, is looking at both sides of the equation. We call that the ROVI, return on volunteer investment. I didn't warn you, we're going to do a little math today, but you can just follow along. And for those of us who love math, welcome. Love to have you. I love math. So it's about taking that volunteer contribution, the number of hours, by the value of the volunteer hours. So you get that dollar amount. Oh, thanks to all our volunteers in the past year, we've had, 100,262 hours contributed, and that's a value of X millions of dollars. But again, it only looks at what volunteers are contributing and the supposed value of that without looking at what we've invested. So the next step in ROVI is to calculate the total investment. What's the cost of staff, outreach, training, recognition? And then you do a fairly simple return on investment calculation, the net value, the contribution minus the cost, divided by the cost. And what you end up with is, here's an example, numbers that allow you to say, for every dollar that we invest in volunteer engagement, we get a return of $4.64 in contributed volunteer value, which for many organizations can be a game changer. We can say to a potential funder, hey, if you want to donate $15,000 to help us upgrade our volunteer management software system, we already demonstrate that for every dollar we invest in volunteer engagement, we get a return of $6 or a return of $8 or a return of $4.32. And that can be a real game changer. It also can be a game changer if you are advocating for investments in volunteer engagement internally, budget lines. Hey, we really need a half-time volunteer coordinator to round out our team. We're already showing a really great return. So I offer that up to you. There are resources that you can access on our website as well to help you calculate that. But I also want to say that it remains a very limited view, because that money, this $330,000, doesn't exist. It's not like you're now able to spend $330,000 on something else as an organization. Volunteers are resource multipliers. They aren't free labor. And when I do ROVI with this topic with a lot of organizations, I see staff all the time looking at this $33 value, and I see them sit back, look up at the ceiling. I see the calculations going on in their head, and that moment that they look crestfallen and think to themselves, I don't even make $33 an hour. Does that mean I'm going to be replaced by a volunteer? It can be a very damaging piece to your organizational culture to only talk about volunteers and their impact in financial terms. Isn't it more valuable to talk about, and some of you mentioned these in Simone said, we share the number of interactions the volunteers have with the public. I think that's really important. Oopsie, sorry. How do you talk about the number of individuals reached as a result of volunteer-led programs, the number of individuals served directly, the services delivered, trees planted, pounds of food collected, change, and even more so, the actual outcomes, changes in behavior and condition for those who are served. If you have a tutoring program, a literacy program, how do the students who are tutored by your volunteer tutors, how do they have, how successful are they as compared to those who didn't get that type of tutoring in getting on track in reading grade-specific reading levels, right? What are the larger outcomes for families who receive food assistance? What does that enable them to do in terms of sending kids to school who aren't hungry, or freeing funds up to pay for their energy bills, whatever those other things are? What are these outcomes? And here's a perfect example from a city just a little over an hour north of where I normally work, the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. They have a program every spring where the community is invited out for a family volunteer day where they work with the parks department to shovel mulch into plantings. Now you have to realize I live in a very drought-ridden state. So this is not just about let's make our city plantings pretty by putting nice, lovely mulch at the base of the trees and the park plantings, etc. This is actually about water conservation as well as beautification. So at the end of this family day where they get a couple thousand volunteers coming out, shoveling mulch and distributing it, they thank all the volunteers and say, oh, thanks to you, we distributed, X metric tons of mulch, and isn't our city beautiful now? But also, here's how much water, how many millions of gallons of city water this is going to save us every year. And that also translates to dollars of taxpayer funds. So what a lovely way to say you didn't just come out with your family to help your community gardens and your parks nearby and the medians, but you've also saved us vital resources in this drought-ridden state. So what are the ways that you can communicate outcomes, not just outputs of number of volunteers, number of hours? And a wonderful lens to do that through is one presented by Dr. Sue Carter Kale. If you're not familiar with her, I'd encourage you to be. She's a wonderful writer and researcher that focuses on volunteer impacts and volunteer value. And she offers this mission-centered volunteer data collection lens of what would it look like if we asked these questions of the people who benefit from the programs, the volunteers, and the paid staff? How do we find out from those who are our program participants, am I in good hands when I'm in a volunteer-led program? Do volunteers welcome and treat me with respect, dignity, and joy? Am I treated as a person or a charity case? Do volunteers look like me and understand my challenges? These are all pieces that could help, through your client evaluations, reveal the value that volunteers bring, not dollar value, but worth to your organization and your mission fulfillment. What about asking the volunteers themselves? Does this make a positive difference? Am I able to live my values through my service? Am I learning about my community and myself? Am I gaining new skills or leveraging skills I already have? And similarly, what about the paid staff as well? Are volunteers partners in my work? Do they free me up to do work that I'm uniquely qualified to do? How do they contribute unique capabilities that make our team stronger and more well-rounded? Those are wonderful questions to guide you in exploring the mission-centered approach to evaluation. All of this information, as we approach in our last couple minutes, the final building block, really leads to how do we recognize volunteers and make them feel valued. For so long, our volunteer recognition efforts in this field have been focused on what I like to call the pins, plaques, and parties approach, right? And more today, volunteers are not motivated by pins, plaques, or parties. When we do research with volunteers and ask them how meaningful would these different types of recognition be to you, overwhelmingly we get a sincere thank you, an understanding of the difference that I make. It doesn't mean that sometimes an invitation to a volunteer lunch or dinner isn't appreciated, because people also want to be in community with each other. But these fancy lunches, and I've spent a lot of time coming from museums at fancy lunches and dinners, handing out 10-year pins and 20-year pins. That is not what most volunteers today seek. And so I encourage you to find out through some of your own research, through an annual volunteer survey, through an onboarding form, what would be most valuable to volunteers. And this is just a sample. You should customize it to your own organization. Don't put don't put a trip to Disney World in this unless you're planning on offering that. I say that around the country. For you all, that's actually might be very possible. You're in Florida. But but offer things like, what about selection for a special project? Would someone be motivated and appreciate that opportunity to be recognized for their contributions? So customize this. And then once you gather some information, I recommend 3 steps to thinking about recognition. First is setting the stage for a culture of appreciation. It's part of a culture of engagement. Make it personal, and then nurture that culture ongoingly. So how do we do that? Set or keep it going. Sorry, keep that culture going through a strategy for engagement. So how do you set the stage? First, identify a real need and make sure that the roles that volunteers are playing are actually mission aligned. Second, build an infrastructure for support. Are there designated support people? Do volunteers feel that they're expected when they show up? Do they have a place to hang their coat, a place to sit and have lunch, a badge? Do they have the equipment that they need? Are you allocating space and equipment? Back to that marine mammal scenario, I interviewed dozens and dozens of staff and dozens of volunteers. And when I asked the volunteers, what's one thing you would change about volunteering here? If you could change anything, I did not expect that the overwhelming answer was, we need more brooms. Brooms were a major safety equipment for sweeping water back into the pens in the Marine Mammal Hospital, and it was often hard to find one. Such a small piece of equipment that in this multi-million-dollar organization wasn't going to break the budget, but they felt underappreciated because it was so hard to get a basic piece of equipment. So what's your broom? If we were to ask volunteers at your organization, what's the one thing you would change? What might be that thing that you don't even realize is a simple solution that's undermining volunteers from feeling appreciated? How can you communicate with them and ultimately measure impact and use that impact, reveal the impact and use that as a major thank you? How can you personalize it? Sometimes it's simply about thanking volunteers and acknowledging something that they did. Here's a kudos card from Best Friends Animal Society, their sanctuary in Kanab, Utah. They talk about, did a best friend staff member make your time extra special at the sanctuary? They say staff member. It often talks about, because most visitors don't know the difference between a staff and a volunteer. And when they get a thank you card, a kudos card, they share it with the volunteer or staff member. They put them in a drawing each month, and those who get drawn get a free lunch at their very tasty dining room, or some other little token of appreciation. It's not about major lunches, pins, plaques, and parties. It's about personalizing it and thanking them and letting them know they were noticed and they were known. Finally, think about 3 different cadences for recognition. What's the ongoing formal recognition that might be built in? Things like, does someone achieve a certain status and moves up in level of certification? So now they're qualified to teach higher level CERT courses, if that's a thing, or they've achieved a certain number of hours. I don't love that one, but people should be recognized for their endurance and their dedication. Do they reach 1,000 hours? Great, give them a kudo. Just as important is the ongoing informal recognition. How are we training staff to thank volunteers, acknowledge them by name, provide opportunities to give pats on the back and feedback in an informal way? And then what are those annual things? We always go to those annual, oh, it's April, it's National Volunteer Appreciation or Global Volunteer Appreciation Month. Oh, we're going to have our holiday dinner at the end of the year. Those aren't bad, but in this day and age of episodic volunteering, if you wait till December, the people who served all spring semester may not even be in the state anymore to be part of that event in December. So what's that opportunity? How can we enhance annual recognition with informal and ongoing formal and ongoing informal recognition? So one of the tools that you can download is a recognition e-toolkit, which has a little bit of research as background and also a template for you to plan out ongoing formal, ongoing informal, and formal annual recognition. And you can create a strategy in that regard. So we have about 4 minutes left. Let me just wrap up recognition with a couple key points. And that is that volunteers engage to make a difference. So capturing their impact is not only going to help with their recognition, but it's going to help with recruitment and retention of volunteers. And impact should be revealed not just in hours. We want to talk about quality, not just quantity of involvement. That's when we shift from value of being some really mythical dollar amount, because that money doesn't exist, and instead it brings out the worth that volunteers bring, and that it's up to you to advocate for these metrics to be recognized and valued in your organization and in your community. So yes, if a funder asks for hours and dollars, give that to them. But you can also work with your grant report folks and say, and in addition to this, thanks to volunteers, we received X number of in-kind donations. Thanks to our volunteers, we've gotten this much in cash donations. It's saved our staff X number of hours and has freed them up to do other work. They are a resource multiplier, and we can help author that story. So with that, I'd love to know, in our last couple minutes here, you're welcome to post a question or raise a hand. And I'd really love for you to please take a moment and think about this session, plus last if you were part of it, and identify one thing that you'll do differently. What's one thing that you can take to do something different? Karen, whether this is the answer to that question or not, says, insight to share leaders how we can rethink our current view on volunteers and their impact. If that's your one thing, Karen, I feel like I've gotten one of my big ideas across. So I love seeing that. What else might you all take? What questions you have, or what's one thing you can do differently in the next 3 months as a result of this building block session? Feed forward. I love that. Thank you, Rosemary. Anyone else? Recognize volunteers. Great. Love that, Chris. While folks are typing, I'll also just let you know we have additional tools and resources on our website. If you go to vqstrategies.com, you can go to resources and tools and templates. We have a lot of free downloads, many of them. Brooke, I love seeing that revamping your orientation process will be helpful. Awesome. And Volunteer Florida also has a lot of resources on their website and just as an organization. Jenny loves seeing the quality, not the quantity, and feed forward. That is great. Friendly reminder that you'll be receiving a link with the recording and the downloads and the PDF of these slides. Someone earlier asked where you can see the recording from last week's session. And Brittany, I don't actually know the answer to that, but maybe you can send an email out that has the link to both sessions recordings. that would be great. And I just love seeing these ideas. I want to ask everyone to keep them coming. Remind staff to customize thank yous. Love it. Focus on volunteer outcomes and impact other than wages. And I hope to see you all out in the ether, or maybe at some upcoming conferences, and potentially in future trainings. So thank you so much for everything you do every day. On behalf of Volunteer Florida, I want to thank you so much, and go forth and engage, everyone. Have a great day. I think with that, we're going to conclude, but I'll leave it to Brittany to